All right, so wonderful. So, as you saw, we had a tremendously lively panel on the economy, and now we're going to talk about India's democracy and US India relations. It's a pleasure for me to welcome Amane Jamal, who's the Dean of Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She's the Edward S. Sanford Professor of Politics and Professor of Politics and International Affairs. And she has many, many more accomplishments, which you should read in this book, because we've deliberately put everything in this book so you know this amazing panel that's over here. So I'm going to hand over to her. She does have a very sharp break. You have a hard stop at noon. And so we have a vibrant panel that she's going to moderate, and I'm going to hand off to Dean Jamal. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anna, for that great introduction. And I, on behalf of Princeton and the School of Public and International Affairs, just want to say how delighted we are that this wonderful conference by the India Center, led by Anu, has been put together with all of you, our esteemed guests. This is very remarkable, especially in this pivotal moment as India's emergence and rise is globally setting the themes and questions on a lot of the pertinent topics that we're dealing with, whether it's democracy, democratic backsliding, green energy, women's rights, economic development. It's a really pivotal time to be discussing these wonderful issues. So I want to thank Anu and the India Center and all of you for joining and coming to Princeton today. With us today, we have a wonderful and very talented, exceptional panel. Many of them are my friends and colleagues. Ashu was reminding me that many of us come from Michigan, overlapped at Michigan at one point. So now here we are. So today's panel will be about India's evolving democracy and the US-India relationship. We have two keynote speakers. Ashutosh Varshney will kick off. He's the director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia, and he's the Sol Goldman Professor of International Studies and the Social Sciences at Brown University. There's a more elaborate bio also in the booklet that Anu referenced. And then the second keynote will be delivered by Tanvi Medan. She's the Senior Fellow in the Center for Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. After that, my colleague, Tanu Goyal, she's Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs, will give a brief response and short presentation. And then followed by that, my good friend and colleague, Irfan Nuruddin. He's the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor of Indian Politics at Georgetown University, will also be offering some discussion points. Irfan is also a co-author and collaborator, so we have worked together for many years. So I'm so delighted to be here and to be joined by all my wonderful friends and this esteemed panel. And with this, Ashu, I'm going to hand it off over to you.
And if you want to click it, oh, you have this. Okay. Bottom is to go backwards.
Bottom is to go backward. This is to go forward, right?
That's right.
And do I have a pointer?
Yes, the very top one.
Okay. So this is going back, right?
This is going forward. You're going forward.
This
You can
one.
also use the arrow keys here, too.
Yeah, got it.
Okay.
Thank you very much to Anu. I have it now under control. Okay. My topic is India's democratic backsliding. It's based on, what I'm saying is based on about maybe 5 articles in the last 4 years or so. And the arguments are heavily anchored in democratic theory. So I'm using the core democratic theory in our profession in political science to assess India. And the argument is here. I'll stick very close to the text, to the slides. For the sake of precision, I think it's important to make the argument very precise. Democratic theorists worldwide have recognized India's democracy as historically exceptional. especially given its level of income. I'll have more to say on this, and I'll have more to say on each of these points. But this claim applies mostly to India as an electoral democracy. India has historically functioned less well as a liberal democracy. Over the last decade, however, India's democratic evolution has reached a stage where the electoral and the liberal aspects of democracy have developed a very deep conflict. India's electoral democracy has, on the whole, been quite vibrant. But the liberalism of its polity has been in serious decline. Democratic backsliding in India of the last few years is rooted in the ideology which has guided India's ruling party since 2014. The party has received widespread electoral support, but its ideology is fundamentally illiberal as well as unconstitutional. That is why the clash between the electoral and liberal has deepened, because electorally what is being legitimated, what is electorally approved can in principle devour what is constitutional. And the forthcoming elections, if I have time, are also raising questions about whether the electoral democracy will remain as vigorous as it has been. So, just a few snippets of what some of my very distinguished colleagues in the profession have said about India's democracy. Barrington Moore was the first one in 1966 to acknowledge the exceptional nature. As a political species, India belongs to the modern world. At the time of Nehru's death in 1964, political democracy had existed for 17 years. If imperfect, the democracy was no mere sham. Political democracy may seem strange, both in an Asian setting and one without an industrial revolution. That is the start, the first great recognition by a great social scientist of using democratic theory and Indian data to make a comment. Then, of course, the father of modern democratic theory, I think it's fair to say the father, not one of the fathers, Robert Dahl, writing that India is a leading contemporary exception to democratic theory, and then Adam Przeworski's massive statistical exercise, which I'll summarize for you, where the main claim is that the odds against democracy in India were extremely high. And in lighter moments, he used to say, if you can imagine negative odds, there's nothing called negative odds, it's zero. Or if you can imagine negative odds, that's what India looked like from a comparative perspective. Okay, so let's start with key elements of democratic theory, because that's the starting point of this assessment. There's a minimum requirement and there's a broader requirement. The minimum requirement is elections. Robert Dahl came up with an idea which remains more or less uncontested for the last 6 decades. There are two sides, two dimensions of electoral democracy. Contestation, can the rulers be freely contested by the opposition? And 2, participation, is franchise restricted? Can the voters freely vote? Those are the two dimensions in X and Y, basically, and you can plot the history of various democracies on that. Then there's a broader requirement. It is not only about elections, but the conduct of the polity, especially the government, between elections, the 4 years or 5 years between. And that revolves around 3 liberal freedoms or civil liberties: freedom of expression, freedom of religious practice, freedom of association, which is essentially civil society. Can non-governmental organizations freely form and freely function? That's the freedom of association, which we've come to call civil society, and minority protection. Are they available? Are they strong? There is a side issue here, an important one, which is the relationship between income and democracy, and it's very clear from data that democracies can be established at low levels of income, but the mortality rate of democracies at low levels of income is very high. And finally, who votes? The richer and the more educated the voter, the higher the odds of voting, is the Western conclusion. Basically the Western conclusion. Whether it applies to India or not, let's see. Here is the data on India's electoral vibrancy. Since 1952, 17 national elections and 388 state elections. Power has changed hands 8 times in Delhi and tens of times at the state level. Political scientists don't count anymore the number of times power changes hands at the state level. This is how many alterations have taken place. In 1952, 81 million votes were cast. In 2019, nearly 610 million votes were cast. Turnouts now routinely in excess of 60% at the national level, and in the Northeast, more 75 plus. West Bengal is typically 80%, right? And Northeast is also 80%. The last two elections, 2014 and 2019, had record turnouts over 65%. Prime Minister Modi won two most participatory elections in India's history. There is no other election where 65% of India or more voted before 2014. Even today, out of 28 state governments, nearly half are not run by the party that rules in Delhi. That is, these are all signs of the vibrancy of electoral democracy, that half of the state governments are not with BJP. And until 1989, following mainstream democratic theory, the richer and the more educated used to vote more than the poorer and the less educated. Since 1989, that has turned around. And therefore, we say that there is a plebeian turn in Indian democracy, and you could not have had 65% plus voting or turnout after 2014 if the so-called lower castes had not voted more. Upper castes add up to only about 17 to 18% of India. Okay. Now, here is the Electoral Democracy Index. It's not perfect. This is the best we can do as a profession. I'm in the process of recalibrating this. But if you look at this, very well-known, this is the Indian line from 1951 to 2020. This is the Indian line. This is the West Europe and America line. And these are the other parts of the world. So Indian line on electoral vibrancy through an index was lower only than the Western European and North American line, historically. But there is a great dip after around 2013-14, and you can see it here. It's a great dip, and it has gone below. It's gone below the average, dropping below the average, basically, at this point, which you may not agree with. You may say it should stay somewhere here. But anyway, the point is there's a big drop. But historically, it's been only North America and Western Europe have a higher electoral democracy index, historically, right? So this is something that we will note when we come to incomes a bit more. So here is the income. I'm not going to, this is not my original research. I'm reproducing the best research that exists on this, Adam Przeworski, Democracy and Development. The data set covered 141 countries between 1950 and 1990. Income, as expected, was the best predictor of democracy, correctly predicting the type of regime in 77.5% of the cases. That doesn't mean income predicted all, but income predicted 3/4, which is very high. No other predictor, religion, colonial legacy, ethnic diversity, international political environment, was as good as on the whole. India was of course, not in the 77.5% set. Indeed, democracies that emerged from decolonization after the Second World War at low income survived only in these countries: India, Mauritius, Belize, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Not many of us knew where Vanuatu was until we read Adam Przeworski, and we had to then figure out where exactly it was. Right? The most surprising case is India. The odds against democracy in India were extremely high, said Przeworski. Other poorer examples, poorer exceptions were poorer than India. And if India is the biggest exception on the low income end, and Singapore is the greatest surprise on the high income end. Its per capita income today is higher than that of UK, France, Germany, and in the last 5 years, even the United States. $82,000 right now, according to the World Bank. $76,000 is the per capita in the United States. 2022 December, 2023 December, data by the bank is not out yet in fund. No non-oil rich country is undemocratic. Singapore is the only one. Just a brief footnote, and that occupies 1 minute of my time. Now, from the electoral to the liberal. When do we call a democracy not simply electoral, but also liberal democracy? There are 3 standard liberal freedoms and 1 protection. Okay. Freedom of expression, freedom of religious practice, freedom of association, basically NGOs, and other organizations, basically non-governmental organizations, minority rights. These freedoms are especially important for democracy between elections. Why? It's a standard argument of democratic theory. Once the minimum and necessary criteria of contestation and participation are satisfied, a democracy can attain higher quality, meaning it can become deeper if liberal freedoms between elections are also available, if citizens are free to speak, free to associate, free to practice their faith. Thus, we cannot have a democracy without free elections, but democracy is not equal to elections. A democracy is deeper, more meaningful if non-electoral dimensions of freedom, not simply free vote, are also available. Then there is a special case for minority protections, which all liberal Democrats would insist on especially after 1945. Majorities can protect themselves by their numerical weight. Minorities don't have the luxury of numbers. Hence, minority rights are constitutionally protected in modern democracies. Without minority protections, democracy can become a brute majoritarian force. Example, Nazi Germany and Jim Crow American South, on which I've been working for a couple of years now and will continue to work further. Carl Schmitt, a leading German legal and political theorist of his time, who ended up joining the Nazis, drew a distinction between democracy and liberalism. Democracy was about expression of majority wishes. Liberalism meant protection of individual freedoms and minority rights. Jews in Germany, he argued, could be protected under liberalism, not under democracy. And though he doesn't exactly say that, the implication as you read him is that if a majority of Germans desire the elimination of or expulsion of Jews, that's a democratic wish. And this distinction, therefore, was given up after the anti-Jewish horrors of Europe in the 1930s and 40s. All post-1945 democracies tend to have rights for religious, racial, ethnic minorities built into their political fabric. And this notion of a democracy and liberalism, the way it was drawn, the distinction is people don't insist on the sharpness of this distinction anymore. This distinction is still made. So, liberal freedoms in India. What is our record? India is freest at the time of elections. Short of inciting violence, virtually any argument can be made in election campaigns. Famously, in 2019, the opposition party leader campaigned on a slogan, "Chaukidar Chor Hai." The Prime Minister of the country is a thief. This is how free the campaign was, right, at that point. You may disagree with the ethics of it all, but he was free to say that, and he freely said that Prime Minister was a thief. But once an elected government takes over, restrictions on basic liberal liberties are often placed. Intellectuals, writers, artists, journalists, professors, students, NGOs can face harassment on grounds that they hurt the sentiments of certain groups or undermine national interest. This is rooted in part on how the Constitution has defined civil liberties. I can talk about it, but that need not detain us here. Let's just note that this is the record of liberal freedoms. It's been a problem common to all kinds of governments. Example, Salman Rushdie's satanic verses was banned by the Congress party because of Muslim rights objection to his depiction of Prophet Muhammad. Also under Congress party, M.F. Hussain, one of India's greatest painters, perhaps the greatest painter after 1947, had to migrate to the Middle East because Hindu right didn't like his depictions of Hindu goddesses in his paintings. But these problems, while always present, become especially serious when Hindu nationalists come to power. Why? Minorities automatically get added to the list of targets, not simply writers or artists or NGOs, and a Hindu-centric view of the nation leads to that. India, for Hindu nationalists, read every text of the last 100 years. Every Hindu nationalist text of the last 100 years, starting from Golwalkar and Savarkar and Golwalkar, right down to Deen Dayal Upadhyay, etc. India, for Hindu nationalists, is a primarily Hindu nation, which is a fundamentally unconstitutional idea. It is the same. It has the same status. Politically, it's as relevant as the idea of white nationalism or the idea that America is a white nation, but but constitutionally, America is not a white nation. Though it has been a big theme in the okay, 1 minute left. So now, around these freedoms, let me just pick only one: minority protection, as what's happening. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Act is the biggest here. It came up with the idea in December 2019 that all immigrants from Muslim majority neighbors, except Muslims, can become Indian citizens. And it was called Amendment Act because there was no religious distinction made in India's original Citizenship Act of 1955. All, except Muslims, from India's Muslim majority nations, if they come as refugees and immigrants, can become citizens. And that has already been achieved. What has been promised also, but not yet implemented, is something called National Registry of Citizens, NRCs. NRC, I can go into the details of that. If you combine the two together, this is the result that can be predicted. Since 200-odd million Muslims cannot be deported or interned, the real threat is electoral. Millions of Muslims, if they lack documents, if NRC is implemented, which can be after this election, if they lack documents, will cease to be citizens, potentially losing their voting rights and or welfare benefits. Only citizens will get welfare benefits, only citizens can vote. It can easily become a project of Muslim disenfranchisement, or what we call Muslims as second-class citizens, not equal to Hindus. So I have some data here on vigilantism, which shows that this is a new form of violence that has emerged in India. Riots, which I studied, used to be the main form of communal violence. Riots have declined, and lynchings have emerged in a new form of violence, and the data clearly shows, first of all, that they rose after 2014. You can see this. We can't do this research after 2019. We have not been allowed to collect this data, so I only giving you data till 2019. Here is the rise after 2014. And then the next is who is mainly the target. This is the Muslim line. Hindus are also target. Christians are also targets. This is the Muslim line, many times larger. Many times larger than Hindus and Christians. Now, can I have a minute on Ayodhya? 1 minute on Ayodhya, just 1 minute. Do Ayodhya and Q&A, okay. Do Ayodhya and Q&A. So anyway, the point here is that electoral vibrancy, to conclude, electoral vibrancy has been a dominant feature of India's democratic experience. As a liberal democracy, it has functioned less well, and that is in serious decline now. And one can argue whether electoral vibrancy also will be as strong as it has been.
Thank you so much, Ashu, for those wonderful remarks. And now I'm turning it over to my colleague Tanvi to talk about India-US relations. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion among the panelists.
I don't know.
Oh, I'm just going to.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Princeton, the Chadha Center for Global India, the Lakshmi Mittal South Asia Institute at Harvard, and in diaspora as well. It's a pleasure to be here and on a panel with Dean Jamal, Professors Varshini, Nuruddin, and Goyal. I'm going to talk about the US-India part of this panel, and I will talk about kind of where democracy fits in or doesn't. But as a historian, I often start talks with looking back, in part to kind of context set, but also to kind of give us a metric of where we're coming from. If you think about US-India relations today, we sometimes kind of take the state of it for granted. But just to put that in perspective, 25 years ago, there were US sanctions on India. These days, Prime Minister Modi hails the US as an indispensable partner for India, while President Biden has called the India-US partnership amongst the most consequential in the world. So there was a bit of a reset in 1999-2000, and what has driven this shift over the last quarter century across multiple administrations in both countries of different political stripes? There are a number of broader kind of specific reasons, but overall, this partnership is what it is today. It's because both countries' theories of the case for investing in the partnership have broadly been in sync. Indian policymakers have seen the US as crucial to achieving their objectives, whether those are security objectives, their desire to transform India economically or technologically, or whether it is their goal of India taking its rightful place on the world stage. What about the US theory of the case? Successive administrations have seen India as a key emerging power that offers opportunities for various US stakeholders, government, business, universities, etc., but also India as a country whose choices, regional and global, will affect US interests across the world, and especially in Asia. Now, these cases, these theories of the case, have been bolstered by Delhi and Washington's growing strategic convergence on the Indo-Pacific, or Asia if you prefer. India and the US have a shared, even if not identical, vision for the region, and a shared sense of the critical challenge to their goals and to that vision, which is arising China's uncertain intentions and increasingly assertive behavior. When you take Delhi, Delhi has a range of bilateral, regional, and global differences with Beijing, even beyond the border dispute that gets the most attention. Moreover, for India, there is the question which affects all these challenges and India's ability to deal with them overall, which is the capabilities gap. Just about over 3 decades ago, China and India had economies about the same size. Today, China's economy is more than 5 times that of India. Its defense budget is more than 3 times that of India. So there's a recognition in New Delhi, while there's talk of self-reliance, that does not mean self-sufficiency, because there's a recognition that to deal with India's challenges, along with kind of seeking opportunities, India needs partners. And the US has been particularly useful to India's China strategy in at least 3 ways. 1, by supporting India's internal balancing by helping to enhance India's capabilities. 2, serving as an external balancer by contributing to a favorable balance of power and influence in the Indo-Pacific. And 3, by extending assistance to India during crises it has faced. What about the US and the Indo-Pacific? The Biden administration has made clear that it neither wants to nor can go it alone in Asia. It too wants allies and partners. The Trump administration also said this, put it differently. They used to talk about burden sharing. And the last few administrations have seen India as one of those crucial partners. To different degrees and at different times, they have seen India as a geopolitical counterbalance, an economic alternative, a more trusted technology partner, and a democratic contrast to China. And the desire for India to play these kinds of roles vis-a-vis China and to contribute to regional deterrence and the balance of power in the region has only increased as China-US tensions have intensified over the last few years. And it is this strategic convergence between the US that has led, and India, that has led to 2 things, which I'll talk about a little bit now. The convergences and divergences aspects, which is 1, this strategic convergence has led to a desire and, in actual fact, deeper cooperation in many different domains. But 2nd, this convergence has also incentivized the US and India to manage their differences that continue to exist. So let me look at the cooperation side first. You've seen the strengthening of various pillars of the US-India relationship. I'll mention 4 broad pillars in the interest of time, clubbing together some related domains. But you could easily separate some of these activities that I'm going to point out into even more pillars and separate pillars of the relationship. In the case of each, I'll mention not just the change in the extent of the relationship or the cooperation in that domain, but in the nature of the partnership. What you've seen is the US and India doing things in a different way than they have in the past. Some things that we used to consider stretch goals have already been undertaken. Let me start with the diplomatic pillar. Today, you see regular high-level engagement, with the frequency of leader-level meetings having increased considerably from the past. You're also seeing growing institutionalization in the relationship, with structures that have been created that have facilitated interactions at various levels. So at the cabinet level, you have a 2+2 defense and diplomatic ministerial. But you also now have separate bilateral commercial, economic and financial, trade, energy, health, homeland security dialogues, just to mention a few. You also have deeper and broader working level structures, including, for instance, foreign office consultations that in fact are going on in Washington right now with the Indian Foreign Secretary in Washington, but also things like, for example, an East Asia dialogue, even within that broader kind of foreign office consultation space. You also have some new structures and mechanisms in the relationship. ISET, the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies. And there's also been something new here, which is that this is the first time you've seen a dialogue of this scale led by the two national security advisors in both countries. And this is a new development that recognizes in both countries, there's a recognition in both countries that there's a need for interagency or cross-ministerial cooperation. Now, a sub-pillar, or as I said, it could even be a separate diplomatic pillar in the US-India partnership, involves consultations, coordination, and even collaboration in the regional and global domain, so beyond the bilateral. So for one, the US and India are participating together in what we can think of as interest-based or issue-based coalitions and groupings. So the most prominent one that you hear about a lot is the Quad, or the quadrilateral, with the US and India and Australia and Japan. But you've also seen, interestingly, now a whole set of new ones, including in an area or in a region where the US and India would often clash in the past, which is the Middle East. Today, there's much more convergence there as well. So you have I2U2, which is a US, India, Israel, UAE dialogue. There have been national security advisor level discussions between the US, India, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. You also saw the announcements. Now this initiative somewhat stalled, but nonetheless there is a desire to continue it. Something called IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which is being supported by the US. But even beyond kind of India's extended neighborhood in kind of East and Southeast Asia and the Middle East, you're seeing global cooperation between and these kind of coalitions being formed. So for example, and some of them are ad hoc, for example, on the sidelines of the G20 meeting last year, you saw the US, India, Brazil, and South Africa meet to actually discuss development issues in the agenda for the next few years as these countries take over the chair of the G20. Beyond these coalitions, you're also seeing the US and India joining each other's initiatives, multilateral or minilateral initiatives, such as the US joining India's International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. You're also seeing India join, for example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the Mineral Security Partnership, or, for example, the Artemis Accords, which is about kind of a multilateral initiative that the US leads on governance in terms of exploration on the moon. The US and India beyond this are also consulting and coordinating on building capacity, connectivity, and resilience in third countries. So for instance, the US Development Finance Corporation is financing an Indian healthcare provider's efforts in Nigeria. The US and India have also, for example, been jointly training peacekeepers in Africa. Now, strikingly, I have 1 minute? I thought I had 20 minutes. That's total. Oh. Okay, sorry, I was told 20 minutes. So strikingly, this area of collaboration now includes South Asia, where India had previously been reluctant to see increased activities by external powers. But as China's influence in India's immediate neighborhood has increased, India has become more interested in the maintenance of US power and its presence in the Indian Ocean region. And even though Indian policymakers are not entirely comfortable with the US approach in all parts of South Asia, the countries are consulting more on the region. Finally, in the diplomatic domain, the US and India are also cooperating on the global stage, where previously, again, their interactions were characterized more by clashes than collaboration. Now, this has involved the US facilitating Indian membership of various institutions, and in turn, India seeking to play a bridging role between the US and the global south or the developing world. A second pillar of the relationship is the defense and security pillar. And greater cooperation in these domains is particularly striking because of India's previous reluctance to cooperate in the US with this space. I won't go into details in the interest of time because I think you want me to cut it short from 20 minutes, but I will just speed through this and say, today you're seeing in the defense and security pillar greater consultations, habits of cooperation, interoperability, and information sharing, which have been facilitated by various defense and security dialogues, the signing of foundational agreements which have made communications, secure communications and intelligence sharing possible, several defense exercises, one of which was just completed that involved all the military services in both countries. But you've also seen defense industrial collaboration that has gone beyond India going from acquiring no defense equipment from the US to acquiring close to $25 billion. You're also seeing this in the defense industrial space. So co-production, joint ventures between the US and India, and the US giving access to India to technologies that even some close allies do not get. One last feature of the defense and security cooperation that I'll mention has been US support to India during crises. This was true in the 2019 crisis that India had with Pakistan, but more significantly in 2020, when the US offered assistance during India's crisis with China with diplomatic support, the leasing or fast-tracking of military equipment, as well as intelligence sharing. Third, and again, I'll kind of just give you the kind of top line on this, is the economic, talent, and technology pillar. Economically, this relationship has grown across multiple sectors and become more of a two-way street than in the past. It used to be very asymmetric, still is to some extent, but you've seen that asymmetry shrink. Trade and investment have both grown, but you've also seen now, for example, India engage in new domains like energy, which they did in the past. Hydrocarbons, yes, but also particularly clean energy. You've also seen for India, along with capital and resources, the US has become a major source, if not the leading source of technology, talent development, jobs, remittances, and even tourism. And of course, an increasing number of Indian students in the US has benefited the US in turn by contributing to the innovation agenda here. And you've seen those economic and social connections then kind of lead to increased connectivity, increased diaspora, and that's the kind of people-to-people pillar, which frankly deserves its own pillar, but I won't go into deeply. All of you, or many of you, are representative of it. You've also seen, again, under this kind of economic technology kind of pillar, a specific kind of convergence on the two sides' economic security approaches in recent years. Both Delhi and Washington have de-risking strategies with a mixture of reshoring or indigenization and friendshoring or diversification, and both do see each other as friends in that domain. And so you have seen kind of new cooperation in this space, including in advanced, and India is using this to try to build its advanced technological ecosystem in telecommunications and semiconductors, as well as space. Now, where do democracy and openness and values fit in? What about that fourth pillar? Now, two things have been evident here. I will say sometimes you hear this discussion in either democracy has been the crucial driver in the US-India partnership, or you have people saying it doesn't matter at all. None of those things are true. Democracy, despite what some have argued, has not been the most critical driver of US-India ties. Strategic convergence has historically. Having said that, democracy and openness have been force multipliers and facilitators of the partnership across the various pillars. So you see, even in the economic pillar, what is the case that Prime Minister Modi is making? Just 2 days ago in his statement, he said, come and do business with us because we are a democratic engine of growth. Societal, the US openness to immigration is partly what has helped the economic, technology, talent pillars for both countries. technological domain, the fact that the US is considering India a trusted partner and that India is saying, treat us as a trusted partner, is because undergirding that argument has been the democracy and openness argument. And even on the strategic side, countries that are better able to be internally cohesive and manage diversity are much more effective abroad and are able to focus their resources and intentions abroad. And so governments also look within countries to see how they might act abroad. And this is not just something the US says. I will quote Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, who says, how I behave at home is how I am going to behave largely abroad. And finally, the democracy and values pillar has helped facilitate that facilitator role by building more constituencies in the partnership. And when you want to grow a partnership, you want to add to constituencies, not subtract for them. In the interest of time, because I think I will just very briefly say on divergences, happy to talk about it more, that while these convergences have driven cooperation, the India-US relationship does not lack divergences, risks, or constraints. Some of these differences are on that subject of convergence. China, for example, on prioritization, who to partner with. There are still differences on Delhi's partnership with Moscow and the US-Pakistan relationship for India. There are also persistent differences on economic issues involving the trade, investment, and digital economy domains. And people-to-people ties, you've seen some kind of constraints, including in terms of immigration policies here. That's created problems. And finally, the values pillar in the relationship between these two democracies has come under strain, with US officials and observers expressing concern about the state of Indian democracy and liberalism, and Indian officials demanding non-interference in their internal affairs. And this range of differences also plays out within and across the two governments, creating or reinforcing skepticism about the other that continues to persist despite the significant progress made in the relationship. I have a series of questions about, I'm not, as a historian, I don't forecast, I do scenarios. And there are a range of questions. So I don't think there's a straight line graph. There are various things that might not affect the direction of the US-India partnership, but could affect the pace and the tone. But for now, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A, but for now, I will say, whatever the list of divergences I mentioned, convergences have been outweighing divergences and have provided Delhi and Washington the incentives to manage or even downplay the differences that they do have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanvi, for that very insightful talk. We have about 25 minutes. We're gonna open it up to our panelists for discussion points. I'll go first, then Tanu, and then Irfan, and then we'll have you respond, Tanvi and Ashu, and we'll open up to the audience. We'll try to do all of that. Very good. So I'll pose one question to each of the keynote presentations. Ashu, when we look back, Ashu has an extremely accomplished academic and intellectual career. His first book that won multiple awards back in the 1990s, about 30 years ago, talked about the remarkable accomplishment of India's ability to bridge majority-minority divide, Muslim-Hindu divide, by looking at variation within India. We often say that, there's a Hindu-Muslim divide in India, but what Ashu does in this earlier book is that he looks at the variation within India, where we see in some instances very high levels of infighting between the Muslim and Hindu communities. In other areas, there weren't. And sort of connected up also with what Tanvi was talking about, you attribute this to a deep legacy of interpersonal relationships that sort of emerged out of business cooperation and business linkages that brought together solidarity between Muslim and Hindu populations. And so today, even when we're looking at India's remarkable economic growth in the last several years, we're seeing that it's not bringing the Muslim and Hindu populations together. It's in fact exacerbating the divide. And in fact, your figures show that the situation is becoming more dire in the sense that even India's democracy is being questioned. So what has happened? What happened to those legacies? Is it about people coming to the scene with ideas of sowing dissent among the communities and hatred among the communities, or has that hatred always been there and you just captured a post Cold War era in the 1990s where you were able to sort of at least capture a more rosy picture of what was always there? How would you describe it?
So, thank you, Mani, for 2002.
2002, sorry. It's all blurry, yeah.
So that argument was about local variations in Hindu-Muslim relations. That it was based on cities where violence between the two communities was quite endemic, and cities which looked similar on so many dimensions. But what they did not have was endemic violence. Very low-level violence or no violence at all, right? So that was and the argument was that the long-lasting organic relationships that developed between Hindus and Muslims in business life, professional life, schools, and neighborhood also, certainly interpersonal, but also lots of professional associations, business associations, etc., where they managed to, where there were a lot of interdependencies, that they were able to prevent riots, right? Or lower the violence significantly. And the most interesting case there was a city called Surat in Gujarat, where Hindu nationalists have been in power since 1995, I think. That Surat. Yeah. So there, despite the rise of BJP in power there, even there, riots did not break out. When they did in, for example, city like Ahmedabad, which was very close, but not far away, which was so. And there the argument was clearly the business links that existed between Hindus and Muslims in the city of Surat were holding it together, right? But they were able to. Now, what's happening today is at the national level, right? The variations you will find even today. It's not that you won't. What is happening at the national level, this kind of politics India is witnessing after 1947, after partition of India. So the argument was about sparks and fires. That even in peaceful towns, you can get sparks, a little bit of clash here and there, sometimes even wrestling matches between Hindus and Muslims leading to tensions, etc. Hindu man going out with a Muslim woman or vice versa. In all of these, or cows, and all of these could create sparks, but not necessarily fires. And the social capital that you talked about came in between. Now, so the sparks have become bigger. This is one way to interpret. Connect what I'm saying now to that work to which you're referring. Right? Sparks have become bigger. They're coming from a very powerful source today, the ruling party at the center and its ideology. Right? And how many, whether they'll become fires even in those towns of India where there was an integration between the two communities through business, through education, through this, through that, trade unions sometimes, whether these sparks will be so strong that they will break them apart is quite possible.
And so then taking that, these larger and more significant sparks, Tanvi, to your discussion about the importance of democracy in the U.S.-India relationship. So there's two ways to sort of look at this, right? So I work on the Middle East. We know that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, U.S. will talk about sometimes shared values with Saudi Arabia. We know those values are not necessarily converging on democracy. Yet the relationship is deep and the relationship persists because the fear is that if the U.S. didn't have a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, somebody else will. And so the U.S. will be better off with a strong relationship. So to what extent is that really the driver? I know you talked about there are some strategic interests and priorities, but it's not here nor there, but it's really the shared values. But if we look at Ashu's graphs, not only liberal democracies on the decline, but electoral democracies on the decline, yet the relationship is stronger now than it ever was. And to what extent is this about, A, the rise of China, right, and this remarkable economic model? The average GDP per capita in China in 2000 was $1,000. By 2020, it was $12,000. India is also showing some remarkable growth there. That, you know, China has really become a model that is threatening the U.S., and the U.S. now finds itself having to step in partnerships and alliances to preserve the strategic interest. So that democracy is not going to be a problem, because now, given the fact that the U.S. has been forced to save its alliances, regardless of the level of democracy, could we see even more future democratic regressions, both liberally and electorally?
That part's a question for kind of Irfan and Tanushree and Ashutosh, who work on kind of India, and they can tell you how foreign policy influences or foreign statements might affect. I will say I obviously did a terrible job, because I'm actually arguing, no, democracy has not been the key driver of US-India. I do think, however, it has had a force multiplier and facilitator role. I think the other crucial aspect is when you think about these pillars of the relationship, you ideally want them to all be strong, because it leads to a more stable relationship with kind of multiple support structures. So that if one is not doing well, others can. What happens if you just focus on the China or the defense and security pillars, then there's one load-bearing pillar. That's not a stable structure. So if you want to actually build and keep building a higher and higher structure, you need a good base. And to me, you know, cutting across, democracy and openness have helped both societies. Then it's not just a government-to-government relationship. So when you look at many of these relationships, and there are so many, the Middle East is not just the only place, where even President Carter, human rights president, is the one who overnight changes policy on Pakistan when it becomes strategically important to do so, with the General Zia-ul-Haq, who's a military dictator. So as a historian, I have no kind of blinders on about strategic imperatives. But if you look at those relationships, they tend to be government-to-government relationships. One of the strengths about the US-India relationship is it is a much broader relationship. And to me, that's why I said pace and tone. It will progress faster. You'll see much more convergence. You'll see much more time that policymakers can devote to cooperating rather than fighting fires, if the two sides have a kind of a broader range, including continuing to, on the democracy and openness side, to have those shared values.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanvi. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tanu to respond to the panelists. I know you have a presentation. If you want to just go. Are you sure? Okay, excellent. Please, Tanu and then Irfan.
Working, right? Yeah. Thanks, Anu, for setting together this panel and for the invitation. I just want to go back to this question or this remark that we've seen emerge in the previous panel and also in this panel. That a lot is resting on India's democracy, right? So the optimism about India's economic growth, and perhaps to some extent the India-US relation, rests on India's electoral democracy. And Ashu raises a very pertinent question. Can we just take this for granted? Is it possible that India's illiberal streak will also lead to a decline in India's electoral democracy? And I share less of the pessimism of Ashu. And I just want to talk about one arena in which we have seen true substantive gains on India's electoral democracy. And that is the arena where we see women participate increasingly more in India's democracy. And we see women increasingly turn out to vote. And this is not only a transitory phenomenon which we just see during elections, but even in between elections, Indian women tend to participate more in protest than anywhere else in the world. You know, so if we compare just the average participation of women in the world and women's participation in protest in India, it's higher than the world average. Also, women participate at elections. So I think if I just have to point out a statistic, 62% of all local politicians in the world are Indian women. So when we see Indian women vote, they protest, and they also contest elections. One way of thinking about this is this really a substantive gain? Is this a substantive gain in participatory democracy? And there are two ways in which we can think that, yes, this is a substantive gain. And the first way in which I think this is truly a substantive gain is this has been achieved at the back of party women. So what I call a class of women who have entered political parties at the grassroots. So they are party workers. So they are Mahila Morcha workers in the BJP. They're also in the Congress, and they're also in the Aam Aadmi Party. So it's not only a BJP story. So we see a true rise of Indian political women as party women, which we haven't seen before the 1990s. So this is a very substantively different picture that we have seen, or stories that we have heard of Indian women just being tokens of their husbands. But we see a true substantive rise of this class of politicians at the grassroots in political parties. There's another way in which women have substantively gained. And when we look at, there's now in India an idea of a women vote bloc. The terminology of vote bloc was traditionally associated with caste politics or religious politics in India. But now we are in an era where we talk about women as a vote bloc, where parties are trying to woo women voters. And this terminology does not exist anywhere else in other industrialized democracies other than the US. So we are seeing this substantive picture emerge where women are gaining both substantively in terms of redistributive politics, right? So we see goodies and goods being targeted at women. We also see women not only in between, during, at elections, but we also see this class of women in political parties. So there is a very substantive way in which electoral democracy has deepened in India when we look at the participation of women in these different forums. There's also an illiberal streak, right? So going back to the first panel, whatever we say about India, the opposite is also true. And I don't think I'll have time to talk about the illiberal streak, liberal side of this story, but they also exist at a liberal side. I think I'll have to share some optimism, from the pessimism that Ashu shared, that we are in a vibrant era of Indian women's participation in electoral democracy.
Thank you so much, Tanu, for that very important, quote unquote, we'll say quote unquote corrective, because women's empowerment is on the rise in very significant ways. I'm going to turn it over to Irfan, and then we'll open it up. Irfan, I'm going to give you a few guardrails. Given what's happened in our country, in the United States, right, where we've seen democratic backsliding, we've seen challenges to democracy, and even globally, where the U.S. today is being questioned on its own moral authority in many domains, like at the UN. Given this backdrop, what are you seeing in terms of the future of India's democratic trajectory, both liberal and electoral, but also for the U.S.-India relationship? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amani. Good morning. Firstly, I just want to say congratulations to MR and Sanjeev and the Indiaspora team. I've had the privilege of working with them since really the creation of Indiaspora. So it's so exciting to see this. And congratulations to Tarun and Anu and the teams at Princeton and Harvard for pulling this off. I used to do something similar at Georgetown, and organizing a one-campus India conference is herding cats. Doing a pan-US academic conference is really incredible. My children also want to thank you because they reminded me regularly this is the closest I'm ever going to come to being affiliated with either Princeton or Harvard. And so, I finally achieved the Desi dream, as it were. As it was. So both WhatsApp family groups are very proud of me right now. So, okay, so lots of thoughts. I mean, and again, it's unfortunate that we're going to be cut short on time, so I'm going to see my job over here to be so provocative that the only thing we're talking about for the rest of the day is this panel, given that we might not have enough time in the Q&A. I think the hard part on the democracy thing is, yes, there's contradictions, but we have to deal with the fact that we're talking about 200 million Muslims who are effectively eliminated from public life in India. If the BJP achieves its goal of winning 400 seats or 350 seats or however many seats it needs to rewrite the constitution, what we will know, what we can guarantee, is that a complete number of 0 of those seats will be held by Muslims. Right? They don't nominate Muslims for tickets, right? They're not part of it. So all of those women workers for the BJP, they're not Muslim. It is an elimination of Muslims from public life in India, and truly, more generally, I mean, if I'm going to cast stones, I'll also say, I mean, if you look at the program of this incredible conference, right, and this dangerous game I'm about to play, but forgive me, As far as I can tell, there's a sum total of one person on the conference agenda who has a Muslim name. C'est moi, right? And as my Catholic mother would tell you, I'm a really crappy Muslim, right? I mean, they're saying Muslim in name only. My poor father gave me my name, but that was about all he did for my Muslim identity. So the number of voices that we have, even in the diaspora, right, who are not speaking just for Muslim stuff, but actually talking about India, is vanishingly small. And we got to deal with that. So the question really on the democracy stuff, we'll continue to have elections, we might not have elections, right? But is what does, and this is why Ashu's argument articulated very bravely, both in academic and in public outlets, about comparing what's happening in India to the Jim Crow South is so critical, right? Because the Jim Crow South coexisted with a vibrant democracy for white people and for much of America, right? But what was true for blacks in the South was the recognition that on any given day, a wrong look at the wrong person could lead to violence committed against you with complete impunity. That is the case in India right now, right? So 2 days ago in Savitri-Bai Phule University in Pune, a young Muslim man was beaten up by a gang because of love jihad, right? Last month, a group of foreign students offering namaz during Ramzan were beaten up. Hindu gang walks in, pulls them out of their dorm and beats the crap out of them. No arrests, no one's going to go to jail, right? None of that stuff. The vigilantism and lynching that is demonstrated over here is regular. So I'm half Catholic, half Muslim. The Catholic side of the family only talks about whether or not they can get Portuguese visas and passports. And the Muslim side of the family is completely freaked out about the fact that they don't know where birth certificates are, right? And this is a family that can draw its roots back to the 1800s, but they are petrified about what will happen with NRC and how they sort of work in a public domain and express their Muslimness, right, as it were. So let's put all of that. But on the US side, I think the real question, and I want to take some issue with both President Eisgruber and Amani's comments, because we've come to start talking about India as emerging, right, this wonderful emergence. India's always been there. India was a signatory and a charter member of the United Nations in 1945, before independence. The non-aligned movement, even though it's become a bit of a punchline in cool circles in Bombay and Delhi, right, was an incredible articulation of an independent view of how global politics should be organized and where India fits in that. The Indian example of non-violent satyagraha and the independence movement served as inspiration for freedom movements around the world, including Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the United States. So we need to push back against the idea that just because finally we're on the radar of Washington, D.C. policymakers as a possible balance against China, that now we're emerging. We've always been there. You can't ignore 1 billion people, right? We've always been there. The question is whether, and Tanvi said she's a historian, no forecasting. Ashu's the academic, Tanu's the academic. I'm a DC creature at this point, so I'm going to do the forecasting, right? So if we're in 2050, right, celebrating, what would that be at that point? The 10th electoral victory of Modi ji, right? What would success of global India look like? Is the success of global India that we are a really crappy democracy in which Muslims have been segregated to complete apartheid status, but like Saudi Arabia, we enjoy a really close relationship, lots of weapon systems being exchanged, lots of economic activity being exchanged? Is it that we're Egypt? Is that we're Turkey, in which every second semester IR student can articulate, here's all the examples of American hypocrisy on democracy? Is that success over here? Or is it that India is standing on the world stage articulating what is in fact a set of values that we could all be proud of, right? Democracy, etc. So I think one of the questions that I would pose to this conference and to all of these conversations is that what exactly are we trying to achieve over here, right? What does this actually, what are we pushing towards in that regard? Final point on the US. My last book was a real detour. I started it as a book about Hindu nationalism in the early 2000s, and it ended up being a book about Christian nationalism in the United States, right? But the education over there was that the core of democracy and the way Americans think about themselves is vital. We call this in this book American religious exceptionalism. The idea of America as a city on a hill, inspiration, etc. That coexists in the policy world with a strategic thinking that allows them to make the compromises in the real world, right, that we can articulate. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, lots of places in which there's not necessarily a perfect convergence, but security considerations allow them to do that. India is a unique case in this regard in that it was a vibrant democracy. It is a democracy. If backsliding occurs, it'll force American policymakers to come to terms with the fact that a country that had been hailed as being a democratic partner no longer is. And while the executive branch, the smart people in the National Security Council and the Defense Department and State Department might be fine with that, the average American congressperson will struggle deeply with that particular idea. And if some of that illiberalism and revanchism begins to hit churches, right? If there's another killing of a missionary, Graham Staines and his family were burnt alive, right, 10 years ago. Churches have been attacked and burned, right? If that continues, then you have a gap between the political, the legislative branch in thinking about India and not. So on the one hand, I agree with Tanvi completely. We don't have to buy into the Americans' rhetoric that they have somehow been champions of democracy and that they shared, that is copy-paste plagiarism of every speech now that comes out of a US policymaker's voice. But I do think that we should be concerned that if the worst occurs in India in terms of backsliding, that there will be fissures in the United States that are not advantageous to any of the broad goals that I think we're all seeking to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Irfan, for those comments. And Tanu, we're going to open it up for Q&A for the rest of the panel. Very interesting questions. I think we're going to try to extend by 10 minutes. So maybe we should take 2 questions at a time, Anu? I'm going to stay until they come summon me. Okay. Which I think they're already out there. But anyways, I will then hand it over to you. Anu, we have a question here, please. Please state your name.
Subbu had a question.
Right here.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Sheetal Kalantri, and I'm a law professor. So question, great panel, super diverse, super interesting. For Ashutosh, is the electoral backsliding, how much does it relate to the freedom of speech repressions that we're seeing? I think that's one issue that doesn't come out in the Western media as much. And the fact that not only opposition leaders, anybody, right, academics, feel uncomfortable to speak and how that impacts the electoral backsliding. And the question I actually also have for Tanushree is how much of the progress you're seeing in women is related to quotas/reservations? And sorry, finally, with one final question for Tanvi. So as a historian, if you could go back and see that the non-alignment movement didn't happen and Jawaharlal Nehru did in fact reach out to the US, do you see that changing the history of the relationship and maybe the democracy would be a bigger factor drawing the countries together?
So much. Do you want to take another set of...
One more.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping we're keeping notes so we can respond.
Varshney, in addition to the communalism that has been promoted by the ruling party here, how would you estimate the impact of the widening, very deep disparities in income levels, which have been reported and commented on very, very significantly recently, on the erosion of Indian democracy in the future?
I didn't have enough time to talk about the data on freedom of speech. Data is very hard to get, right? But freedom of association is easier to get. Civil society, how many civil society organizations have lost their licenses, have been shut down, or that's easier to get. But I have never seen India's intellectuals. I was born there, I lived there for a long time, and now, even though I've been living in America for 4 decades, I'm in India 3 months a year. I've never seen this kind of climate of fear, that intellectuals are afraid to speak, right? The intellectual vibrancy that India had. I mean, you could criticize Mrs. Gandhi, you could criticize, etc. But the idea that you can't criticize the existing government in Delhi and the climate of fear around it, and universities can't do it. And research centers which were critics can be shut down. Right? This is all new. And whether it's contributing to electoral backsliding, it's certainly contributing to liberal backsliding, because the freedom of speech is a very important part of the liberal side, right? That's where it's counted. Elections, are you free to speak? Can you say the Prime Minister is a thief? Well, that's what was said. Now, whether that can be said in this election is not clear. That might happen. In this election, people watch what they say, and certain kinds of criticism they will be very afraid to make.
The follow-up?
There was a follow-up question.
I was saying for the other panelists. Tanu.
Just on the great question on kind of looking back in the past. So I won't say too much. The book that I wrote was actually on that period from right up to 1947 to 1979. But I will say, even then, there was a phase. We look back, the regular thing is the US-India was strange till 1999, and then they became engaged. It's actually a messier history. In some ways, a better history than now we know, because we have the papers on both sides. But it's actually a deep period of engagement between the US and India in the 50s and 60s. And in part, it echoes some of the reasons today, which was you had somebody who's considered a villain in US-India relations usually, John Foster Dulles, go to Capitol Hill and make the argument in 1957 that it was in US interest to support the rise of democratic India and help it win its race with Soviet-backed communist China. Because this time nobody knew that the Great Leap Forward was going to really, destroy the Chinese economy. But at that time, the Chinese economy was doing that. It was very explicitly the fact that yes, India was going to balance China geopolitically, but it was about that democratic contrast. And so I actually, on Irfan's point, I do think if you see an India that's very different, or for that matter, if you see a US that's very different domestically than it is today, you will see this affect the broader relationship. Because I can tell you, one of the questions I get around the country when I go, and I try to talk to non-specialist audience particularly, they always ask about Indian democracy, the association with India as democracy. But even in places like Washington, where at the end of the day, both on the Hill, it's true that there are questions on the Hill, but even the Hill is, strategic imperatives are taking priority. But I will say the question that I'm hearing from business, from government, from people in general is, do we don't want to make the same mistake with India that we made with China? So is India going to be the next China, or is it continue to be the non-China? And that's very much related to the democracy and openness. So I think it was there in the past. It's there today. I'm just very realistic about the fact that I've heard people make arguments in articles in Foreign Affairs and others that democracy was the driving reason for the partnership. That is not true. And for all the reasons we've talked about, the US is not going to be the solution to any issues, just like India is not going to be the solution to some of the problems we have here.
I just want to respond to your question on quotas and what role quotas have played in this story. I think quotas are very integral to this story. And when you see women in local politics, both in rural and urban elections, these women who have entered these positions have really invested and hustled to bring women into the grassroots of the party. So we see that to rise politically and to deepen women's political participation at all levels of politics, these women have relied on creating extra structures that are not reliant on quotas to basically rise in the political ranks. So we see both the effect of quotas, but also, I would say, a second step that we've seen, emerge on this landscape, that women are using these opportunities to carve opportunities that are not quota dependent within parties. And just going back to what Irfan said, because it's really in my mind, these opportunities have only been crafted for Hindu women. And if you just look at the liberal streak, that's part of the story, right? So Muslim women have been kept out of this picture entirely from the quota side as well. So where have these quota opportunities gone? They have gone to Hindu women. And when you look at these extra opportunities that Hindu women have created in the parties, they've also gone to Hindu women. I hope I've answered both.
I'm going to just have one more question. Oh, no, that's, sorry. We are actually really short on time. So I'm going to ask if people can just make the questions. We may not answer them. But there's lunch, and you should sit and talk about this. There's 50 minutes of lunchtime. And so I do know have a question. So I want to introduce Shazeen Athari, who's also on one of our programs in sustainability. I'll have her ask a question. We had a panelist from the previous ask a question, and I thought Subbu was here. So let's just have a voicing of the questions, and then we will take them as well to lunch.
Irfan, this is a question for you. Thank you so much for your comments. I'm curious about what alternative visions you have for 2050. So you painted one which was really pessimistic. I've got Muslim Indian parents that live in India right now, so they have similar concerns as yours. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more about alternative future visions.
That for lunch, we have Rohit, Subbu. I'll go here and then come forward. And let's document these questions because I just don't think we have time to answer all of them.
My question was actually for the first panel. I was wondering if anybody from the first panel is around. Yeah, great, thanks. So what do you think about Subramaniam Swamy's views on Indian economy? I know we're in Princeton, but nonetheless, he's a Harvard economist, you know? So.
I'll be silent about Princeton and Harvard right now.
Hello. Thank you very much. So this question is for Professor Ashutosh. So he's talked about politics between elections, a piece of evidence that may also be relevant to consider. If you look at the Pew Research, they asked the question, across religions in India, are you free to practice, your religion? And the data that came out from there is actually about close to 90% of the minorities respond yes, that they are, they are free to practice their religion. So I think that's an aspect that would help complete some of the, the data that you're talking about. A second aspect, this relates to your, evidence on lynchings. So I don't have a paper, but I was very curious, looking at your finding. And so what we did, me and my team of research associates, we went and read up, a little more than 100 incidents, both the English media reporting of the incident in the English media and the reporting of the same incident in the vernacular Hindi media. And this is what we found. And the reason we actually are not able to write it up because natural language processing models for vernacular media actually have not developed well. And in order to be able to write a paper, we can't do it with those 100 that we read. Interestingly, what we found was that depending on whether the minority is a victim or a perpetrator of the lynching, in the vernacular media, both instances, names are reported as they are. About, proportions actually vary, but the names are reported. In the English media, if the incident actually involves the minority as a victim, the names are reported as they are. But when it is actually the other way around, and the article states very clearly for safety reasons, either they change names or they don't report the names. And this is an aspect, that is, I found it very curious. As I said, this is small sample, it's not large sample, but I think what we as economists would basically think about, there may be a measurement error, what we call an errors in variables problem, actually, with the findings that you have on lynchings. Thank you.
Just very quickly, one can argue that there is a certain intrinsic pluralism, and this divides people immediately, to Hinduism and Indic way of thought that actually may have helped reinforce democratic principles. So what I've been wondering for a while is that, and especially with the stuff that Ashu talked about, is what is political Hindutva, has it been seen doing to Hinduism? And I know I'm taking you out of the context of data and into the realm of political philosophy, but it's not just that what is it doing to politics. What is interesting to me is that what is it doing to Hinduism?
Have the last word from Hitesh. Last question. Raise your hand, right?
Well, I'd better summon up some intelligence. Look, just a couple of quick questions. I know we're not discussing them, but Ashu, what I was wondering about, because you presented something very brilliant, and it's made me think more deeply. So what were the causes for India's exceptionalism? We had a question kind of related to that. And what is driving what you see as the change now? And I just think analogically to the US, we had Obama's election. Now we have what most people would consider a back step from that. But it's not a simple equation. Many of the working class white people in key states who voted for Trump actually voted for Obama, actually twice. So what is it behind the scenes that's driving this political cultural difference in India? And I also had, one thought about the exclusion of Muslims in public political life. It's a reality, definitely with the BJP, but also with Congress, which has not put a single Muslim candidate up in Gujarat in decades, for local elections. But at the same time, the schemes that the present government has successfully implemented on public benefits, including small loans to businessmen and so forth, the evidence seems to suggest that there isn't a religious discrimination in those. So how do we think about that? And finally, Ashu, you said even in Surat, where the BJP was in power, we had a lower incidence of violence. So the other thing to think about is the number of mass-scale violence incidents are definitely lower than they were historically. And the worst riots, except for the horrible riot after Godhra, have happened under Congress rule. Nelly, the Sikh massacre after Indira Gandhi's assassination. So what is it that drove that mass violence then, if the BJP was not the regnant ideology? Those are the questions that came to my mind. Thank you all.
All right. So on this note, I'm going to just offer a couple of connections, and then I want to thank the panel and Dean Jamal, who had to leave for another meeting. There are many dots to connect here. One is, the contradictions that we always said. India is inherently contradictory. There's so much diversity. Dean Jamal and Ashutosh talked about the local versus national politics. Hitesh raised this question, which Dean Jamal did too. Was it always there? And is this new? And then there are these other questions, which are more data-driven questions. How do you interpret the data? So what I see is actually a lot of richness for a white paper, because I don't know how many of you feel it. My head explodes when I read news about India. It's like, and I think if we could organize this panel, and it's not only the panelists, those of you who would like to join in, I think that would be a huge contribution, because there is just so much that we hear about divergent views. And the two other things I want to connect with the afternoon panels. We talked about bottom-up. So far, we've talked about policy. The afternoon panel on inclusion will actually talk about health disparities, actual numbers, and I believe, if Sangeeta is here, the data is actually 2014, pre-2014 data, and then there's some new data which is post-COVID, so we can let aside all this politics and set it aside, and actually look, what does disparity mean? And in the second half of the inclusion panel, we're very honored to have Dr. Lakshmi Barwa, who's one of the veteran Dalit activists who brought up the idea of Dalit diaspora, and Professor Divya Cherian talking about this bottom-up issue, which all of you have alluded. How do you have social capital? How do you build social capital for social justice and equity? And then we'll talk about urbanization and sustainability to wrap things together into the environment and health. So there's lots to come. I just wanted to say that I don't think, I could not have thought about a dream panel compared to the panel we had here. So I just wanted to thank all of you on the panelists.